Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian cases and today we are covering a very special solved case. These crimes occurred back in the 90s between 96 and 97 and as of September 24, 2020, we can officially say that this is a solved case, as this was the day that a verdict was reached in court. I think many of you, especially my local Perth people, will be very familiar with this case, but some of you of course won't be. So I should tell you that today's video won't actually be discussing the crimes that occurred in great detail, but who the Claremont serial killer was. That is Bradley Robert Edwards. We'll be discussing who he was as a person, his life and crimes pre and post Claremont, the evidence that led to his arrest, and a brief discussion about the arrest itself. As this video is already going to be long enough, I decided to make it a two-parter. I know people don't generally like two-parters, but I think in this case, splitting up the information makes more sense and makes it a little easier to digest. Plus, I think you really need to know Edward's background to understand what I'll be speaking about in part 2, which will be the trial, the evidence, and the verdict. And by the way, I'll be including some timestamps down below for your convenience. Just keep in mind as well that I am taking a very long-running and complicated case and compacting it into 2 half-an-hour chunks, meaning I'll be discussing the key points only and leaving out the rest. I do actually have a video on this case from about 2 years ago, but with everything that we now know post-trial, the video seems to me to be a little lacking in detail. So if you do watch it, just keep that in mind. I am going to give you as well a quick 60-second summary of the crimes in just a moment, just to catch anybody up that may not be familiar with this case. And before we start watching, let me know down below if any of you watching did grow up in Perth or Western Australia, like myself, and tell me what you remember, if anything, about these crimes. Having said all of that, let's get into today's case. So here's your quick summary on the case. On January 26, 96, which was Australia Day, 18-year-old secretary Sarah Spears goes out for a night on the town with friends in the upmarket suburb of Claremont. At around 2 a.m, she leaves Club Bay View and phones for a taxi. Minutes later, Sarah's taxi arrives, but Sarah is nowhere to be seen, and she has not been seen since. In eerily similar circumstances, just over 4 months later, 23-year-old childcare worker Jane Rimmer is on a night out with friends in Claremont. She was last seen in the early hours of June 9, 96, talking to an unknown man that she does appear to know on CCTV footage outside of the Continental Hotel, and the man in the CCTV has never been identified. Jane's body was found 55 days later, covered in surrounding vegetation in the semi-rural suburb of Wellard. 9 months after Jane's disappearance, 27-year-old lawyer Kira Glennon is again on a night out with friends in Claremont. Kira left the Continental Hotel in the early hours of March 15, 97 and was last seen walking along Stirling Highway just after midnight before stopping to talk to somebody in a light-coloured station wagon. The driver of the vehicle has never been identified, and 19 days later her body is found in the semi-rural suburb of Eglinton, and like Jane, her body was covered in surrounding vegetation. Both girls had also died of a neck injury. And if you're not from Perth, Eglinton and Wellard are basically at opposite ends of Perth. I'll place a map up on the screen for you. Okay, so chances are that was longer than a 60-second summary, but anyway, these crimes became known locally as the Claremont Serial Killings. And up until December of 2016, nobody had ever been charged in relation to the crimes, although they did have one prime suspect for many years, and that was Lance Williams, who of course turned out to be completely innocent. But that is a whole topic within itself. So on December 22, 2016, 20 years after the crimes began, an arrest was finally made. A quiet, single, suburban, unsuspecting Telstra technician named Bradley Robert Edwards would go on to be charged with the murders of Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon, and eventually Sarah Spears, as well as several other earlier crimes. So let's discuss who was Bradley Edwards and what led investigators to this man that had never once been on the police's radar as the Claremont serial killer. Born in December of 1968, Edwards grew up here in Western Australia and spent the first few years of his life living in caravans with his parents, Bruce and Kay Edwards, and younger brother Troy, before they could afford to move into their own home in the Perth suburb of Huntingdale, when Edwards was 8 years old. I did see 2 or 3 articles mention Edwards having a sister as well, but I can't say for certain if this is accurate. You'll have to let me know down below if you have any idea of this, because I could not find any information to confirm it or deny it. His family struggled financially for those first few years. For example, the floors of their family home remained concrete until his parents could afford to lay carpet several years after they moved in. But the Edwards children were given the basics, like food, clothing, and an education. Edwards went to Huntingdale Primary School, where he was apparently teased for wearing glasses, before attending Gosnell's Senior High School in his later years, where he earned the nickname of Bogsy. And what is Bogsy, I hear you ask? Well, I have no idea. Edwards was considered a quiet and socially awkward student who, in his Year 12 school book, Year 12 being the final year of high school, here in Perth, on a satirical list of future ambitions, he wrote life member of AA, or Alcoholics Anonymous, because Edwards apparently had a bit of a reputation for being a cheap drunk. He graduated high school in 1985 and the following year began work for the telecommunications company Telecom, which eventually became Telstra. It wasn't too long after this that Edwards began his crime spree, starting off with relatively harmless crimes associated with his alleged fetish for women's underwear, before escalating to more serious and harmful crimes. These crimes became known as the Huntingdale Prowler. So let's discuss exactly what he did. In 1988, in the suburb of, you guessed it, Huntingdale, where Edwards still lived with his parents and brother, and maybe sister, he began, prowling the streets, stealing women's underwear, nighties, nightgowns, and kimonos from their washing lines, and sometimes inside their home, and then wearing them as he continued to commit these crimes. From what I was reading, it was kind of known that Edwards had a women's underwear fetish, but I think that people that knew thought it was kind of a joke. That's the impression I get anyway. So during this crime spree, if Edwards was trying to be stealthy or go unnoticed, fly under the radar, he failed miserably. He was seen by multiple people over the course of 1988, yet somehow, despite being a local Huntingdale resident that grew up there, he was never identified. On one occasion, a woman walked into her spare bedroom of her home to see a man dressed in a blue satin dressing gown rummaging through her drawers. And on another occasion, he was caught just lurking in a resident's home before fleeing. The woman that saw him described what he was wearing as a flowy garment. Edwards was even spotted wearing underwear on his head during his crime spree. I mean, each to their own, but it's a little bit odd. It's a little bit odd. But on Feb 15, 1988, his crimes went from creepy to violent. Edwards broke into a home, again in Huntingdale, through an unlocked door, wearing, as he loved to do, a woman's nightie. He then creeped through the house. He shut the bedroom door of the parents that lived in this home, disconnected their phone lines, and headed towards the bedroom of a sleeping 18-year-old girl. Edwards climbed on top of the girl, straddling her, while he attempted to push a piece of cloth into her mouth. However, the young girl, who was now very much awake and in shock, fought back. She starts to scream, and this commotion is enough to scare Edwards away, sending him running, fleeing from the scene, so fast that he left behind 2 items that he had stolen from other neighbourhood homes: a black pair of knotted stockings and a silk kimono. Little did Edwards know at the time that the silk kimono he dropped on his way out would be one of the pieces of evidence that would be his undoing. Police also managed to lift fingerprints and a palm print from not only the attack but from several of the break and enters in the area. The prints were at the time put on record and filed away, and it would be another 28 years before the Huntingdale crimes would finally be solved. During the late 80s, I'm going to assume in or around 89, as I couldn't find the exact date, Edwards meets his future wife. The woman, who has not been named at the time of recording this video, met Edwards through a man that she was actually dating at the time that worked with Edwards at Telstra. It wasn't long before she broke off that relationship to be with Edwards, and soon after this, the couple moved in together into her 3-bedroom villa that she had shared with her previous boyfriend in Naranda, the suburb next to where I grew up actually, so that's great. By all accounts, they were a happy, sociable couple living a normal suburban life. Edwards continued to work for Telstra, and she worked at a legal firm. They owned 2 dogs and had a horse that they visited every weekend. So let's skip to May 6, 1990. Edwards' girlfriend brings up what is apparently a bit of a touchy topic for him: marriage. She wants to know, since they had been together for a while at this point, if and when it was going to happen. The couple bickered back and forth about the topic, with Edwards apparently not too keen on the idea, but they eventually made up, and the girlfriend didn't think too much of it. Not at the time, anyway. Edward's parents, Bruce and Kay, were and are still together, by the way, just for context. The next day, May 7, Edwards was on a work assignment at Hollywood Hospital in Netherlands, which is right next to Claremont, coincidentally. During his shift, he asks 40-year-old social worker Wendy Davis if he can use the toilet stall next to her. Wendy, who is keenly trying to get through her work that day to get home for her daughter's 11th birthday, mutters a yes but doesn't take too much notice of the young man, except that he was a Telstra employee. When Edwards re-emerges from the toilet stall, Wendy remembers thinking to herself that he had only been in there a brief moment, hardly enough to even finish his business. But this thought was abruptly interrupted when Edwards grabs her from behind, puts a piece of cloth in her mouth, and begins to drag her towards the toilet stall. Wendy, who is terrified that the cloth has some sort of chemical on it, tries to avoid inhaling, but when she is finally forced to breathe, she realizes that the cloth is clean and begins to struggle back against her attacker. And this is when something quite strange happens. Edwards suddenly stops. Standing there looking dazed and disorientated, he begins to apologize to Wendy. Security is quickly called after this, and Edwards is handed over to the police, who find cable ties in his pockets. Edwards is fingerprinted and soon charged with common assault, for which he pleads guilty, and he is sentenced to 2 years probation, as well as being enrolled in an 8-week sex offender treatment program. Unbelievably though, Edwards does not lose his job after this incident, and in fact, just several months later, he receives a promotion. And despite the fact that the attack took place during work hours, the assault was never recorded on his Telstra job record. Wendy Davis, however, was forced to leave her job several months later due to trauma. And I do believe that Edward's girlfriend was aware of the incident, as he did pick her up from work every day, but of course on this day he failed to do so. Plus, I imagine it would be kind of hard to hide this, given that he was caught and charged. So, in 1991, Edwards and his girlfriend Mary, despite his objections from a year earlier, and they move into their first home in Huntingdale, not too far from his parents. It is not too long, however, before their relationship turns rocky. Edwards, who is obsessed with his computer, often staying on it until the wee hours of the morning, slowly begins to push his wife away due to this obsession, and in turn, she feels ignored and practically invisible. In 1993, his wife meets and befriends a man at her work who is going through a divorce. The pair grow quite close, and the man, who has not been named for legal reasons, confides in Edwards' wife that he will soon have nowhere to live. So Edwards and his wife offer him a room to rent in their home. And this arrangement, although a little odd, ends up being beneficial for both parties. It helps Edwards and his wife out financially, and it gives the man going through a divorce a place to live. However, the boarder, we'll call him for now, said the arrangement was initially a little bit awkward, as he did actually have a little bit of a crush on Edwards' wife. But I am guessing that Edwards never noticed this, and the three of them apparently got along quite well, and things were going just fine. Initially, at least. That was until the boarder and Edward's wife began an affair right under their roof, and even slept together, as Edwards, who was apparently a very heavy sleeper, slept in on his weekends off. During Edward's marriage breakdown, but before he found out about his wife's cheating, he commits his most violent crime yet. And side note, for those that don't know, the Claremont trial was open to the public and unsurprisingly had a very high attendance rate, to the point where on the day of the verdict, people started lining up at 4 a.m. I got there at 7 a.m. and I thought I was early. Anyway, myself, I attended 3 full days in court. One, as I said, was the verdict. Another one being the day this crime was discussed, the Karakatta rape. The victim had their statements read out in court that day, so believe me when I say to you that this was a violent and traumatic attack. I won't be going into any kind of detail, of course, but if you want to skip this portion, I will include a timestamp. So, in the early hours of February 12, 1995, a 17-year-old girl was walking home alone through Roe Park in Claremont after a night out somewhere between 2:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. Out of nowhere, Edwards comes up behind the girl, grabs her, gets her to the ground, and straddles her to keep her from moving. He then ties her hands behind her back, shoves some kind of soft material into her mouth, places a hood over her head, and throws her into the back of his vehicle. She's then driven around for a while, only to end up a few minutes away at the Karakatta cemetery. There he takes her out of his vehicle, picking her up and taking her into the cemetery, before dropping her to the ground and dragging her through the dirt. This is when he rapes her. The victim, who again has not been named for legal reasons, keeps her eyes closed for the entire attack, believing it was safer if the perpetrator believed that she had not seen him. And the entire time the attack was happening, the girl had believed that she was going to die. When the ordeal was over, Edwards picks up the girl, who had been pretending to be unconscious, and throws her into some bushes before driving off. Still naked from the waist down and hands bound together, the girl gets up and realizes she is in a cemetery. She runs out and sees some houses on the road, but at this point she was not too keen on trusting another stranger. So she runs to a phone box where she calls her father, before making her way to the nearby Hollywood Hospital, which is about 1 kilometre from the cemetery. And if you're wondering, by the way, how she made a call at the phone box with her hands tied behind her back, she said that she had used her face. So very skillful. At the hospital, a rape kit was carried out, and the DNA from the rape kit was handed over to the police. The DNA, which would become known as unknown male 4, would later become a vital evidence in solving the Claremont case. And after the Claremont crimes happened, police did actually connect it to Karakatta, but could not prove that they were actually connected until 2008, which I will get into later on. Also at the hospital, when the girl's father was helping to remove the cable that had tied the girl's hands together, he noted that it looked like a telecom extension cord. So back to Edward's marriage. In December of 95, Edward walks in on his wife and the boarder kissing. The boarder immediately says that he will pack his things and get the heck out of there. But in a strange turn of events, Edwards, although upset, is quite calm, all things considered, and asks the boarder to stay. But he declines Edward's offer, and within weeks he is moved out. The boarder would later say that he didn't want to risk staying in the home knowing what Edwards had under the bed, which was apparently a baseball bat and a rifle. In January of 96, his wife also moves out of their marital home, initially moving in with her parents and then moving in with the boarder, or I guess her lover. Edwards, now alone in the marital home, starts to drink a fair amount, but he did have some friends that were periodically checking up on him. By all accounts, Edwards was actually coping relatively well, or at least as well as anyone in his situation could be, or I should say, appeared to be coping well from the outside, besides the excessive drinking. The only bit of real emotion Edwards shows about the cheating is after his wife moves out. He phones his wife's lover and says something kind of odd. "You're having an affair with my wife," Edwards tells his former housemate, to which he responds, "You're stupid, you know I am." This insult must have stirred something in Edwards because he tells him, "I know where you live and I'll come and kill you." But luckily for the boarder, it appears to have just been an empty threat, and he never really sees or hears from Edward again. Interestingly though, to this day, the boarder believes that Edwards is actually innocent of the Claremont killings, believing he just does not have it in him to commit these crimes. Also interesting is something Edwards would later say during a police interview. He tells police he believed that his wife cheating on him was his karma for taking her away from his workmate, who she had been dating when they met. He also said that he had no animosity towards his first wife at all, and in fact, his parents, who had always been quite fond of her, stayed in touch with her for many years. So as I said, his wife moved out in January of 96. On what exact date, I'm not too sure, but on Australia Day, which is Jan 26, Edwards decides to make an unannounced visit to his wife's parents' house, which is where she was staying at the time, and he ends up staying for dinner. Now, you'd think that since he had just shown up out of the blue, he'd be pretty keen to talk about their marriage breakdown, but he doesn't bring it up even once. Instead, he invites his wife out that night to go watch the Australia Day fireworks, but she declines. According to the wife, Edwards isn't upset by this rejection and goes home later that night, seeming just fine. That same night, in the early hours of the morning, Sarah Spears goes missing. A few weeks after the disappearance of Sarah Spears, Edwards invites his estranged wife out to a family event, which she happily accepts. That night, the pair end up sleeping together and she stays the night in her former marital home. The following morning, she approaches Edwards as he's ironing his work shirt and tries to bring up the topic of their broken marriage. But he hardly responds, And it's at this point that she believes that their marriage is most likely over. Fast forward to June of that same year, Edwards receives some what I would imagine to be pretty harrowing news. He finds out from his estranged wife that she is pregnant to her new lover. Strangely, Edwards doesn't seem upset over this news, at least not outwardly. Edwards would also later admit in a police interview that him and his first wife did want to have children, but at the time they could not financially afford it. So I imagine that his wife getting pregnant so soon to her new lover would have been a bit of a kick in the gut. So days after Edwards receives this news, on June 9, Jane Rimmer disappears in eerily similar circumstances to Sarah Spears, and the city of Perth are now in fear and believe that a serial killer is on the loose. Between late 96 and Feb of 97, Edwards gets into a brief relationship with an older woman. And it should be noted that this is a time period when no girls are going missing from Claremont. However, by March of 97, Edwards is single again, and this is also the month in which he sells his first home. A home which he was apparently very proud that he was able to buy for himself and his wife. And he moves out and back into his parents' home, where he would remain for several years. Now, skipping to the night of March 14, Edwards had made plans to meet up with some friends who live in the suburb of Dawesville, which is about 1 hour out of Perth. But Edwards doesn't show up until the following morning, telling friends that he had been trying to reconcile with his wife. Also that night, in the early hours of March 15, Kira Glennon goes missing. Weeks after Kira's disappearance, in early April 97, Edwards meets a French-Australian woman named Catherine, who would eventually become his second wife. Also at this point, the Claremont serial killer goes dormant. Now, from my understanding, which is pretty limited, a serial killer rarely just stops killing. They either die, they move cities, or they're incarcerated for an unrelated crime. Edwards doesn't fall into any of these categories, but there is another possibility. Circumstantial changes causing him to stop. Edwards meets his future wife weeks after killing Kira, and their marriage, spoiler alert, goes on to last up until 2015, 1 year before his arrest. And I'm guessing you've probably picked up on a pattern by now. When Edwards' relationships are going bad, he commits a crime. When they're going well, he is behaving. I'll also add in here, but I'll speak more about it in part 2, that none of this relationship circumstantial evidence, we'll call it, was taken into account by Justice Hall during the trial and when, of course, reaching his verdict. And it is just that, circumstantial, but interesting nonetheless. And to me, at least, there just seems to be one too many coincidences in here to be, well, entirely coincidental. But let me know your thoughts down below on all of these relationship issues coinciding with his crimes. I think, yeah, again, it's too coincidental. So, as I was saying, Edwards met Catherine when he came to fix some Telstra cables at her workplace. Catherine, who already had a younger daughter, born in 1994, made it clear to Edwards from the get-go that they were a package deal. And by all accounts, Edwards embraced this. In fact, he raised and treated Catherine's daughter as his own. And from my understanding, they had a very close father-daughter relationship. And by the way, I am choosing not to say his daughter's name for her own privacy, as it is a super unique name, a really pretty name though, so it makes it far too easy for any of you watching to Google her. And quite frankly, what her stepfather did doesn't have anything to do with her or her life now. In 2000, the couple and the daughter move into a modest 4-bedroom home on Acton Ave in the suburb of Kewdale. This would be the home Edwards would now live in until his 2016 arrest. So I'm going to pretty much just breeze through the next 16 years of Edwards' life post-Claremont. Catherine and Bradley Edwards eventually get married. They never have their own children, and Edwards continues to work for Telstra. Around 2003, Edwards and Catherine begin volunteering at their local Kewdale Little Athletics Club, as their daughter was attending there, and soon after at the Belmont Club. Edwards was a timekeeper, photographer, and some articles said that he was a coach as well, but I'm not 100% sure on that point. I get the idea that he did a number of things as a volunteer, so maybe he didn't fall under any specific title. And apparently Edwards also had a pretty good rapport with the kids, and in general he was pretty well liked. In 2007, Edwards became the president of the Belmont Club and soon went on to receive a Community Service Award for his tireless work and contribution to Little Athletics, even landing himself his photo in the paper, which I'll insert here for you. Also in that same year, Edwards joined a local football team called the Central Crocs Masters, as he was a massive footy fan, where he actually happened to play with a police officer who had been working on the Claremont case. Members of his footy club described Edwards as one of the quieter players who enjoyed a few beers, but above all, was a good, helpful guy. In fact, Edwards spent his spare time building and maintaining the footy club's website, as he was apparently quite the computer enthusiast and expert by this point. And not to mention, he was actually a pretty big gamer. I'm not really going to go into too much of that side of his life, but from what I read and researched, he loved computers. He was really good at using them and fixing them and understanding them. And he sounds like he was one of the people that got on the internet quite early back in the 90s. And he's actually left quite the, internet fingerprint, I don't know, because he went under the name Brevincat, I think it was. I'm just trying to remember this off the top of my head. I think it was Brevincat he went under. So the name, no one else is going to be called Brevincat on the internet, so he's quite easy to track down online when he's been in forums or he's had a gaming profile, and it's pretty easy to find the remnants of where he's been, what he's done, and what he's interested in, including his Facebook profile, which is still up somehow. But anyway, as I was saying about the footy club, he helped with their website, and he also assisted with the Little Athletics website as well, from what I understand. Oh, and by the way, I can't really say what Brevincat means because it could give away something that I don't want to say in this video. I'm sorry to be so cryptic. But anyway, so in this footy club, he earned himself a new nickname, which was Shorts. And like Bogsy, I don't know what it meant, but maybe this photo I'll have up on the screen for you now of Edwards in some interesting gold shorts could have something to do with it. I really don't know. So Edwards would go on to become a lifetime member of the Kewdale Little Athletics Club, and in 2013, at Edwards' 10 years of service to Little Athletics presentation ceremony, try saying that 10 times fast, the former WA Labour leader himself, Eric Ripper, shook hands with Edwards, thanking him for his work as a volunteer. And there is actually a photo of the two of them shaking hands. I'll have it on the screen for you now, and somehow this is one of those images that really gives me the chills. The state of WA had been chasing this man, the Claremont Killer, for years, And here is one of our politicians unknowingly shaking hands with a killer, thanking him for his service to the community. I feel like Edwards would really have got a kick out of this somehow. So I guess you could say that Brad Edwards was considered by all a pretty upstanding citizen. Now, jumping back into discussing his marriage for a moment, it was around 2014 when things started to fall apart. Catherine said that she was, quote, sick and tired of the lies. And she would later state, when questioned during the trial, that she feared for her life, but was cut off before she could elaborate. In July of 2015, Catherine moved out of their Kewdale home. However, the daughter remained living with her stepfather right up until the day he was arrested. Edwards would later say the breakdown of his second marriage led him down the road of depression, although he was never officially diagnosed. So from mid-2015 to 2016, Edwards was once again single, although not living alone, which begs the question, was he feeling the urge to kill again? Now, from everything that I have read and listened to, and keeping in mind that I am clearly no expert, Edwards kind of seems like the classic psychopath. He blends in well to his community, he's an upstanding citizen, keeps a low profile, he's somebody that nobody would suspect, not even his family, and no one ever did suspect him. We may also categorize his lack of remorse, which I will discuss later and in part 2, as a sign of being a psychopath. Also, his unusual and violent sexual urges, his escalating crimes, and finally, his urge to kill. Again, and I want to make this super clear, I am no expert on psychopaths, and I do not claim to be. I'm bringing this up for the sake of discussion, but if you happen to have any kind of qualification in this area, if you're a psychologist or a psychopath, comment down below what your thoughts are. Also, something I found very interesting was something FBI criminal profiler David Caldwell said back when the Claremont killings first happened. He stated that he believed the Claremont killer had recently found themselves living alone and said, quote, "This person is probably very bright, very much in control of himself, has all the outward appearances of a very stable person. This is probably a very pleasant, normal appearing person. I dare say when this guy is arrested, I guarantee that people are going to be absolutely astounded. They're going to say, I work with this guy. He's my next door neighbour. Surely it can't be." End quote. Does that ring a bell at all? I've also seen Edwards categorized as an organized killer, as opposed to disorganized. And one of the traits of an organized killer is that they appear perfectly normal to everybody around them, but deep down, they are psychopaths. Ted Bundy, for example, or Dennis Rader, who was the BTK killer, or Ed Kemper, who was the co-ed killer. These are just a few examples of an organised killer. A few other things that point to Edwards being an organised killer is the way in which he disposed of the bodies. He took them out to remote areas and took the time to cover the bodies in surrounding vegetation. And the fact that there was 3 separate crime scenes, where Edwards picked the girls up, where he killed them, and where he disposed of them. Although to this day it is unclear exactly where the girls were killed. And lastly, the fact that he evaded capture for 20 years. Although I'm not sure Edwards really did make any special kind of effort to avoid a capture. I think he just got really lucky, honestly. But forensic technology did eventually catch up with him, which I'll discuss in just one moment. Disorganized killers, in contrast, are often young, come from unstable homes, don't plan their kills, may be mentally ill, below average intelligence. They often have drug or alcohol problems, and will blitz their victims, meaning they come out of nowhere, surprise attack them, and leave them for dead at the scene of the crime. Edwards was obviously so methodical in his kills that he managed to get 2, possibly 3 intelligent young women into his car on the nights that they went missing, either willingly or at least without anyone seeing or hearing a thing. And to this day, we still have no idea how he did that. But moving on from the criminal psychology aspect, which I could honestly discuss all day, I find it incredibly fascinating. But again, I'm no expert, it's just a discussion point, so leave your thoughts down below on everything I just said. So now we're going to move on to the portion of this video where I discuss exactly what led detectives to Bradley Robert Edwards being the Claremont serial killer. The first real breakthrough for the investigation didn't happen until 2008, 11 years after the Claremont killer went dormant. That year, exhibits that were part of the Claremont investigation were sent off to the UK for a new form of testing, called low copy number testing. The technique was quite new at the time, and although it had had its controversies, it was considered reliable. So, low copy number testing, in layman's terms, allows for DNA that is minuscule to be tested. From what I read, it can test samples 1/1,000,000th the size of a grain of salt. So, pretty bloody impressive. One of the exhibits that were sent over for testing was Kira Glennon's fingernails. As Kira's body had been found sooner than Jane Rimmer's, 19 days versus 55 days, her body had the highest chance of containing usable DNA. When Kira's fingernail samples were tested, a male DNA profile was able to be extracted from Kira's left thumbnail and left middle finger. This also proved that Kira had fought back against her attacker, scratching and fighting for her life. Years earlier, her father, Dennis Glennon, said that he did not believe his daughter would have gone down without a fight. And he was absolutely right. And it would be this DNA that Kira had managed to get under her fingernails that would soon become a key piece of evidence leading to the killer's arrest and conviction. The following year, in early 2009, the extracted male DNA was run through the WA DNA database, and it came up with a match to the unknown male 4 DNA from the 1995 Karakatta rape. Investigators could now say for certain that the Karakatta rapist and the Claremont serial killer were one and the same. This was also around the time that the investigation's top suspect, Lance Williams, was told that he was no longer a person of interest, although he would unfortunately not live long enough to see the 2016 arrest. But despite this very exciting breakthrough in the case, investigators still did not have a person on their database that matched up with the killer's DNA, and once again, the case went cold. 5 years later, a few more pieces of evidence would be discovered that would later become vital during the trial. Microscopic blue polyester fibers that had been found on the Karakatta rape victim's shorts were found to match with blue fibers found on both Jane and Kira. However, at the time, they didn't know where these fibers had come from. After Edwards' arrest, they would discover that these fibers were actually the Telstra blue fibers, made especially for the uniforms of Telstra employees. Not long after this, a different fiber found on both Jane and Kira was identified as coming from a Holden Commodore VS station wagon, which also happened to be the exact same model of vehicle that Edwards was issued for his role as a Telstra technician. Kira Glennon was also last seen talking to somebody in a white Holden Commodore. However, neither of these fibers were enough to narrow down the search for their perpetrator, and the case once again did go cold. So now we're in 2016 and the Cold Case Homicide Unit are reviewing cold cases, as they do. And the Huntingdale attack happens to be one of these cases. The silk kimono that had been left behind at the crime scene by the attacker was sent off for testing at Perth West, which is a forensic laboratory here in Perth, by the way. 2 weeks later, test results were in. Semen stains tested on the kimono extracted a single male DNA profile. The DNA was run through the Perth West DNA database and a match came up. The DNA matched the DNA under Kira Glennon's fingernails, and it matched with a known male for the Karakatta rape perpetrator. So it turned out that the Huntingdale Prowler, or at least the Huntingdale attacker, was also the Claremont Serial Killer. Detectives figured if they couldn't solve the Claremont or the Karakatta cases, maybe they could solve the Huntingdale crimes. So you may remember me mentioning earlier, fingerprints were lifted from several of the Huntingdale crime scenes and stored away. You may also remember that I said Edwards was fingerprinted after the Hollywood hospital attack. Well, when the Huntingdale fingerprints were put into the national database, as you may have guessed, it spat out the name of a man that had been charged with common assault at Hollywood Hospital back in 1990. Bradley Robert Edwards. After this, detectives began following Edwards' every move, waiting to collect DNA evidence until one day, Edwards and his stepdaughter make a trip to the movies. As he exits the cinema, Edwards throws away his Sprite bottle in the bin, and detectives leap to action, grabbing the Sprite bottle from the rubbish and sending it off to Perth West for immediate testing. They soon learn the DNA from Karakatta and Kira Glennon's fingernails was a match. 20 years after the Claremont killer's reign of terror began, it looked like they finally had their man. On the morning of December 22, 2016, the now 48-year-old Bradley Edwards was arrested in his Kewdale home, where he still lived with his stepdaughter, and was charged with the murders of Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon, and in relation to Huntingdale and Karakatta, indecent assault, abduction and rape. And at a point later on, he is charged with the murder of Sarah Spears, just for your information. When police inform Edwards of what he is being charged with, his response is, "What the fuck? You've got to be joking." Edwards' neighbours, who are watching everything unfold, are shocked by the commotion, and even more shocked when they hear the news that they may have been living next to a killer for years. Edwards' neighbours described Brad as a friendly and helpful man, and mentioned how he would often help them out with electronic connections for free. Edwards is soon taken in for questioning, where he is questioned for hours, but he maintains his innocence. During questioning, any time the crimes are brought up, he has very little to say. Although he admits he is of course aware of the Claremont case, as everyone that grew up in Perth would be. However, when he is questioned about himself and his life, Edwards is an open book, talking about his first wife, his second wife, his childhood, his financial struggles, everything. Detectives try all sorts of tactics to extract a confession out of him, such as telling him that his stepdaughter has said he is a man of honour, and mentions to him that he wouldn't want to let her down. But Edwards does not budge. Detectives eventually ask Edwards if he would be happy to be swabbed in his mouth for a DNA sample, and he agrees. The results very quickly come back, and Detective Senior Sergeant Joe Maripodi breaks the news to Edwards. He says, quote, "Brace yourself, Bradley. Your DNA sample was a positive result." Meanwhile, police were searching Edwards' home. During this search, some fairly interesting items were uncovered, including some homemade sex toys, women's underwear with holes cut out for a male to wear, if you get my drift, and some violent erotica stories on his computer, thought to be written at least in part by Edwards, as the origin of the stories was unable to be traced. Investigators also discovered that some of the stories had been modified just days before his arrest, showing he had at least been reading the stories or working away at them very recently. One of these stories, called Chloe, was eerily similar to the Karakatta rape and started with the opening line, "They say you always remember your first. In my case, I consider my first Chloe." Another one of these stories was about a male who was driving around at 2 a.m. and abducts a drunk 19-year-old girl. A few other things that police found were snuff films, and if you don't know what a snuff film is, you are far too young to be on this video. And they also found sandwich bags tied with hair ties full of semen, his semen. Found on Edward's Facebook, although fairly irrelevant to this case, but creepy nonetheless, was a photo posted in August of 2016 of a killer clown character, which is somehow still up on Facebook, by the way. And to go along with the photo, Edwards writes, "Available for kids' parties and bar mitzvahs." And in the comments he writes, "Everyone loves a clown. Emoji, smiley face." Yikes. However, everything found in Edward's home, as well as a lot of what we've mentioned in today's video, was actually not taken into account during the trial and when reaching the verdict. But again, I'll save this discussion for part 2. And that is where I'm going to leave this summary of Edward's life and crimes. Like, comment, share and subscribe for part 2, which will be up as soon as I can get it done. I'm going to be working my butt off for you to get that up. Thank you so much to my channel members. You are all absolute shining stars. Comment down below your thoughts on today's video, and until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I will see you very soon. Bye guys.